very much for coming to this webinar. Today, we're going to be focused on thinking through ways in which we can re-engage students with transferable teaching and learning practices. There's a bit.ly on this screen, and if I advance before you've got that bit.ly entered in to a web browser, don't worry, it's going to come up again. But I do invite you to type in that bit.ly. Please note that capitalization does matter. So when you're typing the LTC and fall, please keep case in mind there. All the letters that are capital and lowercase need to remain so. And again, if you don't see it, it'll be on a few more slides and we'll get to it later here as well. So a little bit about this session. So in this session, we're going to focus on exploring again how to re-engage learners in service of achieving targeted outcomes and creating a great classroom culture where students develop transferable skills and honestly turns responsibility over to students in a developmentally appropriate way. And also, I think, brings some joy back to teaching. And I think this is important right now. We've all gone through a number of years now, a couple of years with pandemic learning and whether that was remote and when we came back. And I was thinking through after talking with Matt about ways in which we could surface some skills, some strategies to be able to make teaching more engaging for you as educators, for those that you serve, if you're an educational leader, and ultimately for students to increase their engagement. So you're going to become aware of a particular framework, a way to think about engagement. And I'm going to be using the high quality PBL or high quality project-based learning framework elements as one possible frame from which to view how we engage students. So we'll talk about some use cases related to transferable skills for students and for teachers in their teaching practices, and then how they connect with all of you in your own practice. And then we'll also be exposed to a set of different protocols, very specific and practical structures that can be used to engage students and foster equity of participation in any grade or subject, and develop a set of transferable success skills for students while also turning more responsibility at a developmentally appropriate manner, again, over to them. And all of these protocols will be shared with you. You're going to have access to them through that bit.ly. And then we're going to share other practices with one another. Even with those that are here today, we're going to ask you to contribute your ideas. I'm just coming at this from one perspective, and there's multiple ways, and I want to acknowledge that, to think about re-engaging students. But I'm going to provide us a lens, a framework, and then some very specific structures about that. So a little bit more about me. I'm a former classroom teacher. I've held a number of different positions: curriculum coordinator, ed tech director, building level admin, all of that. And now I'm the senior director of learning innovation at Hapara. And I'm really excited about that. You might be thinking, what is Hapara? Well, we specifically make the Google Workspace productivity suite much easier for teachers to be able to use. So it's a complete instructional management system that helps focus on deeper learning outcomes and building up student agency and responsibility. And part of that includes engaging them. And so just a real quick word as to why the name that doesn't sound like something you might hear every day. So we were born and created by educators in New Zealand in 2010 in a group called the Malaya Kalani area. And educators there realized that they needed an effective way to manage learners and the work that they were doing in a digital environment, and that the practices they were doing in a kind of paper and pencil world didn't always translate effectively over to a digital environment. So they collaborated on designing a dream tool that would streamline the teacher workflow and deepen personalized learning and increase student engagement. So they emphasize a straightforward design that would empower teachers, regardless of their technical background and disposition, to be able to provide ongoing feedback, track learner progress, share files, and facilitate collaboration. And so from that, our first part of our suite was born. So we'll talk a little bit later, but that's just a quick background on who I'm working for these days. Most recently, I should mention as well, I was with the Buck Institute for Education. So some of you might know them as PBL Works, and might have been, if any of you use project-based learning, one of your go-to locations for resources on PBL. So a little bit why I might be throwing the PBL frame in here as well. And whether or not you're using PBL, everything I talk about today, you can apply regardless if you use that teaching methodology or not. Okay, so enough about me. I'd love to hear about you. I think we can use the Q&A feature, but Matt, feel free to check me on that if I'm wrong. And let me know a little bit about you. Where are you from, specifically what district, if you feel comfortable acknowledging that, and what is your position, if you feel comfortable. What I'm most excited about is learning a little bit more about you so that I can get to number 2. What are you hoping to get from this session? That will allow me to make sure that I'm tailoring what is presented today to best meet your needs. So if you could go ahead and use the Q&A feature within Zoom to respond to these questions. All right, so our driving question is really this: how might we as educators re-engage students with transferable teaching and learning practices? I'm going to use that driving question or essential question to frame the following information that I share with you today. Again, a lot about the framework from which to think about re-engaging students, and then kind of how to do that through protocols. So again, I do invite you to think about this driving question. We're going to have an opportunity to reflect on this very specific question at the very end of this. Okay, so re-engaging students. Let's talk a little bit about the what around re-engaging students. I'm not going to do a deep dive into research. I'm really going to focus on making things as practical as possible so that you have some takeaways that you can put into practice, whether you're a classroom teacher, a school leader, instructional coach, whatever your role is, so you can be very equipped, if you will, to put this into action in your environment. So when I think of re-engaging students within the context of this presentation today, I think it's really important, as I mentioned earlier, to think about a framework to guide how we think about re-engagement. We're going to use just one of a couple different frames, but it's a frame that is both open source, meaning you can find it online free, and I'll share that with you in just a few minutes. And then it's something that you can take and adapt outside of just PBL, as I mentioned earlier. It can be used in a number of different instructional environments, no matter how old or young your students are, no matter what your subject matter is as well. And then we're going to talk about kind of the how. How do we get to re-engaging students through the lens that I'm going to be talking about next? And we're specifically going to be diving into structures that are flexible, that are student-centric, and really take and engage students by putting a little more responsibility, developmentally appropriately so though, on their shoulders, and will be connected to very specific outcomes in a variety of formats that, again, will be adaptable, yet provide some predictability and structure so students can focus on the learning. All right, let's move into our first section. But before I do so, again, I just want to be clear. Please drop your questions in to chat or the Q&A, or unmute yourself if you're driving as well. Love to have you do that at any point in time. Okay. HQPBL, again, means high quality project-based learning. If you're not familiar with the framework, I would encourage you to pull up the URL that's on your screen. Again, if you're driving, Matt, will they have a copy of this slide deck? Is that something folks that are maybe not in front of a computer can access later? If not, we can take the essentials and maybe put it out in an email or something.
No, we will definitely put the link to the slide deck and
Perfect.
the recording in folks' inboxes after we're done.
Awesome. Okay, thank you very much. And the reason I mentioned that is just being, again, sensitive for those of you that may not be in front of a computer. And I will try to verbally describe what we're seeing on the screen and keep all of you in mind. But there is a URL in the lower right-hand corner, hqpbl.org. And I would invite you to pull up that URL. There is a free PDF download of this framework. Again, it was originally written to answer a question, what really is PBL? And this may be about 6-ish years, 7-ish years ago. Those of us at the Buck Institute for Education, in conjunction with multiple stakeholders, lots of other people in the PBL space, began to realize that there was a need to think about what engaging and high quality instruction look like, because there are so many different definitions of PBL. Again, you don't necessarily need to be a PBL practitioner. If you're like, I don't even know what PBL is, you're going to get a quick overview of it real quickly here. But regardless of whether or not you're a practitioner, I think it's a helpful frame to think about how we can effectively engage students, because both research and practice has proven time and time again that project-based learning, or at least these elements, when put into practice, can greatly increase student engagement and outcomes. And I'm happy to answer kind of the what and where I got those ideas from if you're interested later. Okay, so let's dive in. What is this framework? So the HQPBL framework has 6 different elements. And these are not intended to be tablets from on high, but rather concepts that are worked out within your particular instructional role and your particular environment so that they meet the needs of your students. So One point, and all of these could be used to engage students, of course, but we're going to narrow in on two of them that I'll talk about that are highlighted here. But I just want to briefly touch on what I mean by these terms. So intellectual challenge and accomplishment, students are going to learn deeply. They're going to learn to think critically and strive for excellence. In HQPBL, students are going to be working on something that's authentic. Boy, talk about engaging students. We could have a whole other webinar just on that topic. Students have a public product where they're going to be displaying their work. It's going to be critiqued. They're going to get some feedback on how they can move the work forward, even if the project itself is done. Okay, all that drives to the first point that we're going to focus in on the framework today, which is collaboration. I think one of the great ways to focus on re-engaging students, especially at the beginning of the year, of course, is collaboration. And sometimes that can be really hard to do in a way where the learning doesn't get off the rails. And I'm going to give you some very specific structures to help keep collaboration from going off the rails. And when I'm using the word collaboration today, I'm specifically thinking of ways that students in person or online are both going to give and receive guidance, work cooperatively together through a particular activity. And it could come from their peers, but it could also come from adult mentors, including those that are classroom teachers or other experts that may be in their life or in their learning environment. Project management, teaching kids how to do that is another way to increase engagement, make sure that they're doing well. But the second point that we're really going to focus on through this lens is reflection. And students are going to reflect on their work and have an opportunity to think about how they learn through, in this case, a project. But again, even if you're not using project-based learning, you can still use some of the reflection activities that we're actually all of them that we're going to talk about today, and collaboration to increase student engagement. And again, I think that the techniques that we're going to focus on with collaboration and reflection are just one way to look at this. But again, if you're thinking broadly about engagement, and again, whether or not you're using PBL, this is a frame, a lens through which I think we can look at re-engaging our students at the beginning of the year so that we can align it to great outcomes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So before we get into some strategies, I just want to kind of highlight a little bit more about the why I pulled up this particular framework, and I'm recommending it for consideration when you think about how am I going to use these activities to support outstanding learning outcomes. One is that when instruction has meaning to students, they're going to connect to it. When that learning is connected to real world problems and students create and resolve problems rather than just regurgitating information, I think students really step up and get really engaged. And again, we'll talk about how that works itself out, both with collaboration and with reflection. And then students get to apply what they've learned to the real world, hopefully beyond the walls of the classroom. But regardless of that, the collaboration and reflection are things that they can take and apply to other classes, their own learning on their own, the world beyond the walls of the classroom. So now let's take a quick break, and I would invite you to either unmute or drop any questions that you might have into the chat. So I'm going to take a quick drink here as water as you perhaps unmute and ask any questions about what I just shared before launching into the how.
Thanks, Rich. And folks, you do have the ability to unmute your mics. If you have any questions, please feel free, tap that little microphone button and let us know what's on your mind. If you're more of a typer than a talker, please feel free to use the chat and the Q&A.
And as we're waiting for those to roll in, if there's none, that's totally great too. I'm going to keep an eye on chat and the Q&A just in case any come in, but I'm going to move us forward with the how. And I think one way to move forward is specifically now getting very practical with a set of things that you can take that are open source, free, that you can put into practice. And the resources that I'm going to share today are all free with the exception of one, which I will call out. My goal, again, is to lower the barrier of entry to this so that you don't have to shell out even more of your money, which I know we all do as educators, to be able to put these ideas into action. So what are protocols? Well, they're structured processes to support focused and productive feedback, and they build understanding, and they help drive student engagement and outcomes. And undoubtedly, you've engaged with these before. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And so one specific means of doing all of this is creating learning experiences where the process and structure that students use to learn becomes a little bit more like muscle memory, so that the content and the learning stays at the forefront, but there's a structure that helps students know what to expect. It's time bound, has very clear outcomes, and clear roles for the students. Additionally, protocols foster equitable participation and helps all students build their transferable skills, the 4 C's. And you're going to hear this theme come up again, such as collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, and communication skills. So it's a little bit about the why on there as well. I want to just walk through an example protocol on your screen. So just to take the mystery out of the term protocols, you likely have used them. And for those of you that already know protocols, you use a bunch of them, that's great. I want to acknowledge that. I also know there may be folks on this webinar that haven't had experiences with protocols. Maybe it's been a long time ago and you're vaguely familiar. Some of you were like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I'm going to start by giving an experience that most of us as educators have gone through, and I'll walk through exactly what it's like, again, in case you have not. So one protocol that you may have experienced is called a turn and talk. A turn and talk allows students to participate in discussions rather than just having one set of students dominate the discussion. I don't know about you. There were a lot of different personalities in my classroom over the years. I taught primarily elementary and some junior high. And sometimes there'd just be those dominant personalities that were the first to jump in or the first to shut someone down. And what protocols do is to give that structure that provides more equitable time and space for all students, even those that are reluctant learners or reluctant sharers, I should say, the ability to be themselves. So all students are able to process the new learning while engaging really in that meaningful conversation with their classmates. And you're going to hear me throughout this talk about protocols that are really student-centric, that you can help your students learn how to run themselves so that, again, we're putting more responsibility on them, increasing engagement along the way. So one key consideration of engaging students, of course, is that each one is a meaningful contributor. Again, that addresses educational equity, but also think that it helps every single student make sure that they're engaging and re-engaging at the beginning of this year. So the turn and talk protocol. So, just real quickly, basically what happens is that an educator or even a student, after they've been using this protocol for a while, have a question posed to them to discuss. And you're going to tell them as an educator how much time they have, the partner's turn, they face each other, and the assignment should be set up beforehand so that students can quickly, discuss and pair up so that they know what's going to happen. And then you're going to set a timer. Maybe it's 3 minutes, maybe it's 3 minutes for each student. But the key is to make sure each student has a clear role. One's a receiver or a listener. One is going to be presenting or talking, and have the students begin discussing the question and prompt. And you might need to model this for your students as well, so that they see that when you're in listening mode, it's truly that there's no interruptions and whatnot. When time is up, of course, the partners are going to share their thoughts out and discuss. That's a very basic protocol. The ones I'm going to share with you next are maybe a little bit more, a couple layers deeper, and I think are going to help increase engagement quite a bit. But I want to give you one that we're probably all familiar with, just to demystify what in the world the protocols are. So again, just connecting back to a slide we already saw, the HQPBL framework. Okay, collaboration is top of mind, again, as I mentioned earlier, because I believe that learning is, at least in part, fundamentally a social activity, perhaps a discussion worthy of its own separate webinar. So Matt, I think I've generated maybe 2 other webinar ideas, and I'm sure you got a whole year booked of great ones, but as a means to re-engaging students. And it's a great way for students to be involved with owning their own learning. In other words, if we are effectively engaging our learners, we can leverage collaboration, just to use that particular element within the HQPBL framework, in a manner that provides each student with opportunities to engage meaningfully with content or learning experiences. Additionally, reflection is a key component with or without collaboration within a learning process. And you probably have heard this statement that's been attributed to John Dewey, but I want to credit my mentor and friend, John Larmer, who is a John Dewey aficionado and scholar. He's not sure that John Dewey actually said this, but I at least want to attribute it to him because it seems that it's become an urban legend that he said it. And he has this quote: "We don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience." And so let's dive into deeper to protocols with this framing in mind, both around collaboration and reflection. And so we're going to take a look at this Padlet. Again, if you haven't pulled up this Padlet already, Matt, thank you. I see that it's already previously been dropped in the chat. It is case sensitive, so please make sure as you're typing this into a web browser, for those of you that are in front of a computer, that you do so. Again, if you happen to be driving and you're just listening in on this and you can't see on the screen, we will, again, make sure that you get access to this Padlet where the resources, free resources are for this session. Okay, so with that in mind, thanks, Matt. I'm just going to move forward to our next slide. And I'm actually going to stop the share and reshare a different screen, specifically one that's going to allow me to kind of walk through some of these things. So on the Padlet, you're going to see the HQPBL framework, the elements that are all listed here along the side. Feel free to comment. If you haven't used Padlet before, you can click down where it says add comment, add your own ideas. If you like what someone's mentioned, you can click a little heart button too. But let's dive into protocols. I have two different sections of protocols, 3 for elementary teachers with a sharp eye toward primary grades, because I don't know about you, but I know, even though I taught in the intermediate grades, a lot of times my primary grade friends would be concerned that whatever was being shared wouldn't work with their younger students. And so I've surfaced some protocols that I'll walk through in a minute, one of which in greater detail than the others for that grade range. And then for junior high and high school students, I have a list of 4 different protocols here. You can just scroll through when you hover over this particular column. And I have some additional resources, which we'll mention in a minute. But just as a heads up, I've provided a brief overview of what each protocol is, so you can quickly scan and see if that's of interest to you. The grade levels that I think that it works best for, from my experience, please note, modifications can be used to many of these, especially in the elementary, to be able to make these work for younger students with modeling, with scaffolds, where you have a small group, model it after maybe you've modeled it, and just kind of building some muscle memory, if you will, over time. And again, the goal here is to build these structures early in the year. You can introduce different structures, different protocols at different points in the year, so that when students internalize these ways of thinking, learning, collaborating, communicating, being creative, it's second nature, and the focus is on the learning rather than the structure. But I want to point that out. I know I've said it before, because looking at these protocols, you might be thinking, wait, this sounds like it's all about the structure. But if we set up these structures, they practice them, they get good at them, then it becomes muscle memory. And when they're used, it becomes second nature. So simple critique protocol is great, a wonderful way for students to work and both give and receive feedback on their work. And it can even work with drawings. It doesn't have to be writing, doesn't have to be math, doesn't even have to be verbal. Your students can even do drawings. And there's a really great example of this over here on the right-hand side. Again, I apologize for those of you that may be calling in and aren't in front of a screen, but you'll see it in the Padlet when you get access. It's called Austin's Butterfly. And one of my superheroes in education, Rob Berger, does a great job of modeling for his students the simple critique protocol that his young students, in this case, I believe they're grade 1, maybe even kindergarten, will then learn how to run on their own, which really engages students quite a bit. So there's that. The tag, formative feedback, telling, asking, giving a suggestion, very commonly used. But one that I kind of want to focus on is the silent conversation protocol. And this is a great one for students to be able to have a quiet time to reflect on somebody else's work, give feedback on that work, and doesn't involve conversation. So if you have a quiet class, or let's say you have a class of students that are maybe very shy and speaking because perhaps they're learning English and just their personalities, not because they are an English language learner, but perhaps coupled with that, they're a little more shy. They're not quite as confident yet in giving feedback. There are ways to be able to do this by pairing them with, say, a student that's maybe a little bit more confident and have them record and write down some of the ideas that that person is sharing. So there's a number of different adaptations and modifications that can scaffold students into learning these structures, again, so they can focus on learning. And then I want to shift over now to junior high and high school, and then I'll take a pause and get some questions from you here. And there's a number of different ones, but what I want to focus on is the formative, and all these are formative feedback tools, by the way, intended to be given before the end, before some sort of summative, arrangement. But what's really nice about the tuning protocol is that students receive instruction on how to ask for feedback, and then a partner will re-engage a student. So if I have a student say, I am looking for feedback on how convincing my argumentative essay is. And so then the person that's reviewing says, okay, what I hear that you are wanting feedback on is how effective, and then fill in the blank. And they say back to make sure. And then they get a specific amount of time to quietly review without any interpretation from the person that is presenting the work, to talk that through. And that can be done with a small group or a partner. And then at the end, then if it was done silently or with a partner, then there's an opportunity for that group or individual to verbally give that feedback to that person. The person then gets to ask some follow-up questions and state how they're going to move the work forward. There's adaptations where you could put in opportunities for students to ask for clarifying questions before they review that work. But what it does, again, is it shifts the responsibilities to students. Students, as you might have heard, I never mentioned outside of modeling, teachers having to drive the protocol, because after the initial scaffolding and training is over, the learning, the engagement works directly with students. So I'm just giving you a couple high-level overviews, but you can click on these. These are all free resources from a couple of different, I think 3 different sources: EL Education, the School Reform Initiative, and I think Edutopia, I have one there from them as well. So I would love to get your questions and answers or questions and ideas, I should say, via chat. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have any follow-up questions around these particular protocols or anything else that I've mentioned. Again, feel free to unmute at any point in time, but I did want to just give you kind of a quick overview there. And again, just remind you, check out Austin's Butterfly. For those of you that are secondary teachers, you're in junior high or high school, you might think, oh my goodness, this is for little kids. Try to imagine it for older kids. Even though I've listed it as something for elementary, this can be done. And the types of modeling around kind-specific and useful or actionable feedback that Ron models here is something that you can model early on, have your students practice and whatnot. All right, I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to go back to sharing the slide deck there. And I want to talk about something else, and it's a book. It's called EduProtocols. And I want to call out specifically that this is one of the things that it is a fee. I can't remember how much these books are going for, but there's a link to this within the Padlet. So if you still have that Padlet open, you'll see a link to EduProtocols on the far right under additional resources. And in addition to the resources I mentioned there, I want to specifically bring forward a series. I believe there's 5 different books in the EduProtocols series. And it takes these protocols a step further and actually does a really cool job of increasing engagement while, again, providing replicable structures that students can internalize. You can model. You might need to refine them, or remind them, I should say, of some of the steps. But they're very short. They put the focus on the learning once that structure is internalized. And it really helps students, again, to, as I've mentioned time and time again, increase engagement with their learning. And I think one of the things that's really important to know about this particular book is that it's been created by educators for educators. And really, if you think about EduProtocols, it's just their brand name, if you will. These are protocols, just like I talked about before. So, and really they're lesson frames in which you put the content of the learning kind of into that structure. And it's going to allow you to deliver that content for students to maybe even drive their own learning as the year rolls on, and they're able to do that in a more effective way. And EduProtocols in particular are specifically designed to help students to be able to develop the 4 C's. So creativity and communication, collaboration, creative thinking, all of those things. And the reason I wanted to bring this specific book forward is that much like I pointed out specifically, that I brought protocols forward for primary grade teachers that sometimes feel left out of conversations like this. I also wanted to bring in a book that's specifically designed for a subject area, social studies in this case, and attends to AP, advanced placement, as well as scaffolds and supports for different demographics, including English language learners. So, for some of you, you might be thinking, this is all fine and well and good, but I teach STEM, or I teach something vocational class of some sort, or maybe I teach, AP, an AP course. And I just wanted to mention that give this book a chance, specifically because it attends those. And I'm going to walk you through one EduProtocol, just very high level. It's called The Hero's Journey. If you're not familiar with that video, you can go out and take a look at it. And really what it is a very structured way to think about telling history or reframing it. And it's a popular way to just kind of set up a narrative and a writing and evaluation around storytelling. So one of the big ideas too is to think about engaging students even before they learn. And this particular protocol in A Hero's Journey helps students to walk through in a very simple manner 6 different considerations about what they know about a particular topic. So let's say, for example, you happen to be teaching on, say, the Magna Carta, or maybe fill in the blank, whatever AP topic that you want. There's kind of broken into 3 different acts, and students describe those acts, call to action, what would that be in the story, all these other elements that come through in The Hero's Journey. And if your students in high school haven't seen that video, it's a great one on YouTube that's really, really short about The Hero's Journey. And really what it does is it provides a template for students to be able to use, and they can put that template into something very simple, like if they're using Google Slides, if you happen to be using other technologies, Flipgrid, other things like that, students can simply record their writing there. But students are going to be listed with, provided a list of a particular historical event. And then really what they're going to do is they're going to, again, as I mentioned, write down what they know already about that particular stage within that arc of what it means to tell a story well. They can also repeat that same protocol later at the end of their unit if you want to use that for a summative piece. And what's really cool, again, is that when you're thinking about AP, just to contextualize that a little bit more, we're thinking about a lot of vocabulary and a lot of facts really, really quickly. And so it's one way for teachers to help students prepare for the end of the course exam without having to just have them memorizing rote cards, but to think more expansively about how the vocabulary, about these key points that they're learning so much content so quickly in an AP course, how they can put all of that together. So that's just a quick overview of the EduProtocols guide. And again, I would recommend that you click on that. There are some free EduProtocols as well that I have listed under additional resources on the Padlet. So while I just mentioned a specific book that does cost money, there are a whole set of free templates if you're like, I want a little bit more information, because I only scanned just the surface. Okay, next. One thing I'll be doing just real quickly is talking about some other tools that you can use. I'll be using Hapara just because I, obviously work in that environment all the time, but you could have students recording their feedback for students, like that silent feedback protocol that I mentioned earlier, to be able to share their work with one another using things like Flipgrid, Seesaw, your LMS. Again, I'm just going to quickly share my screen and talk a little bit about how students can do that online. So just thinking a little bit more about how this becomes more practical, I started thinking a little bit more about specific tools that we can use. So I'm going to share my screen here, a different one than I've shared yet. There's this Hapara workspace. This is just one way. This is a grade 5 example here. Again, you could use a number of different tools. I'm just going to use this, but in this case, there's some materials I can focus just for teachers that they can see. I can differentiate by group and put what the objectives are for the lesson in kid-friendly language, all their resources, have them engage with that reflection in a protocol manner, and submit all that, all integrated with Google Docs. And if there's a rubric that you want them to see ahead of time, how they're going to be graded, you can do that as well. So you can differentiate by groups really quickly and move students in and out. They'll only see the content by their group. The reason I mention this, or an LMS or a Seesaw, is that I would recommend thinking through, of course, what is that online vehicle in which students are going to need to be successful in the collaboration within the structure, so that the structure itself, the tool itself, becomes secondary and the learning itself becomes primary. Again, a theme I've been talking about time and time again. So Now it's your turn. On the Padlet, and again, if you are driving and you can't type, totally get it, feel free to unmute. And if you're driving, you're like, I don't want to unmute. I want to add, I need a little more time to think about this. Can I add my ideas later? Absolutely. The Padlet is a living document. I encourage you to look through this, add your own ideas and share with others. So my question to you is this: what are the ways in which you increase student engagement with your classroom? Add your thoughts in the Padlet, and I'm going to just again point you to the fourth column there. It says ways you re-engage your students, and you can add using the comment feature under the first card, or just click the plus button if you'd like to add your own separate card. That's fine too. And I'm gonna give you just a couple of moments to do that. Add your thoughts to the Padlet. This is the power of learning together. And I do want to say that your ideas do not have to be anything that's been shared before. It doesn't have to continue to be about protocols. You can have a completely different idea. Please bring it on. I believe in the power of all of us in this discussion and those that will be engaging with this after this recording to be able to add their ideas and deepen the work and ideas. So again, go ahead and add your comments into the Padlet in the comment section, and let us know what are the ways in which you increase student engagement within your classroom. And I'll give you just a couple minutes for that. Okay, continue to think about these things. I'm just going to move us along. Jigsaw, yes. Each one, teach one, yes. Great examples, both those comments, so wonderful. And I would encourage you, even after today's over, as you come back, hopefully, to this Padlet, engage with it, and you think of new ideas, you discover new ideas, you have other things, add into this. I was sharing with Matt before we all got on here that there was a Padlet that I created, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago. And recently someone said, I found this Padlet on a particular topic that you did. And I've added some new ideas, and it's always fun to see the growth of Padlets like this over time. So this is a living resource that, again, I encourage you to share with others, deepen, improve upon the ideas shared today. Okay, and as we start to wrap things up here, got just a couple more slides. In addition to helping re-engage students through specific protocols and what we looked at and reviewed in this session, I believe that it's going to help establish a culture, a classroom culture that's really, if done well, engaging for students. And it's going to allow students to understand the norm of providing feedback that's kind, helpful, and specific. You get great examples of that in the Austin Butterfly video. Remember, students will need some modeling and perhaps whole classroom experiences with a particular protocol. But once they're done, and they're intended to be lightweight, these structures, that once you've internalized them and those students internalize them, then the process, again, steps back. It becomes the background, and the focus turns on students really learning the content and engaging with that content, and having a way to do so in an equitable manner that, of course, increases engagement, but also provides opportunities for them to share voices, especially for those that might not normally get to do that. Okay, so I would love to call you to just some quiet reflection yourself. You're welcome to add this reflection activity here in the chat, but how might you as educators and we engage with students with transferable teaching and learning practices? We had some ideas that were added to Padlet, but I'd like you to just kind of internally think a little bit more yourself to take the pressure off of sharing something. You're welcome to do that, but just for you to take a moment to quietly yourself think about how you might re-engage students based off of what we've done today, or maybe some ideas that we didn't talk about, but you had those ideas that are rolling around your head brought to mind as a result. And as I move us into the question and answer time period, I do want to invite you to keep the conversation going. You can find me on Twitter, Rich at EdTech. Matt, I'll make sure that maybe we keep my email and address there as well around. You can also tag us at the Hapara team. If you'd like to learn more about Hapara and how we can support you, great. If you're like, I just want to keep this conversation going educator to educator, that's great too. I love talking about these things, jumping on calls like I've done with Matt already a couple times, I think, Matt, where we've just started thinking about new ideas. How can we better serve those that we work with and collaborate with, like all of you that are on this call. So with that in mind, Matt, I want to call you back into this conversation. I'm going to leave this slide up if it's all right, and let you kind of bring us home here.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. And Rich, Dixon, thank you once again for spending some time with us.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me, Matt. Appreciate it.